Welcome everyone to today's ExChange event entitled A Model of Support for Children in Wales with a Parent in Prison. I'm Alison Rees and I'm going to chair today's session. I was also involved in the research and I was formerly a professor at Cardiff University. The speakers will take 40 minutes, there or thereabouts, and then we'll leave 20 minutes for your questions if you have them afterwards. And if you have questions, please can you put them in the chat and then I can pose them to the speakers. I'll now introduce the speakers. First of all, we have Professor Nancy Lokes, OBE. She is the Chief Executive of Families Outside, located in Edinburgh, and she led the project. We next have Sarah Beresford, who is an associate of the Prison Reform Trust and developed the Child Impact Assessment Toolkit, thinking about the impact for children when a parent goes to prison. And finally, we have Dr. Ben Rakes, who is a social work researcher and until recently worked at Huddersfield University. So welcome, thank you very much to our speakers, and we'll begin.
Thanks so much, Alison. Really appreciate the opportunity to come and speak to everyone today, especially because we're slightly ahead of the game in that the research report that we've done was supposed to have been published by now, but we just got the translation through last week, so it should be out imminently. But we will have a slight delay in terms of sharing of the slides and the recording because we need to wait until it's been officially published. But you get a sneak preview. So really pleased to talk about the project. We were commissioned by the Welsh Government to spend about a year looking specifically at what a pan-Wales model of support for children might look like when a parent goes to prison, but specifically looking at collaboration between schools and prisons. Where possible. So we conducted what we called the Aspire project, which is there was actioning a schools and prisons independent research exercise, but that looks specifically at the well-being of children when a parent goes to prison. So basically, we were trying to look at a national model that involved 5 of us across Wales. So it was, as Alison said, myself, Sarah, Ben, and herself, as well as Polly Walker, who's another research specialist in this area, and supported by 2 very able research assistants, Freya Kenny and Sylvia Stevenson. So it was a very short period of time actually to do really what was quite a broad project, but we were focused very much on looking beyond the immediate research question in terms of schools and prisons collaboration. We're looking at what does this look like from a child rights perspective? How do we really bring the voices of children and families into this? How do we recognize this is beyond a prisons or a schools issue? This is a bigger collaboration looking at health and education and broader justice processes and so on, and how we gather those evidence-based solutions to create a structure that might actually work. We did have an expert advisory group which brought in people from a lot of these different sectors, and that included, again, prisons, probation, health, education, and so on. So it was a really good kind of broad spectrum, as well as families themselves. So we included a lady who had herself been in prison while her children were younger, and someone who grew up with a parent in prison as well. So it was really quite a good, we thought it was a very good model, but obviously you can read the report yourselves and see what you think. So what we did, and I'm just going to cut across this very quickly, you'll hear a bit more of the detail about why this is important and the background for this from my colleagues in a moment. But basically we did a background research to gather together the information about policy, not just what was happening in Wales, but what was happening more broadly in other countries that could be used as models, looking at the literature generally about the impact of imprisonment on children and families, and trying to get an idea of what were good kind of practice examples. And again, we were able to draw upon examples from other European countries, from North America, and really trying to look quite widely at what a model in Wales might look like. We also used the time to establish relationships with key stakeholders. So we only had Alison and Sylvia, who are based in Wales. So that was absolutely critical to have that direct connection. We had 4 of our team actually based in England, and obviously myself up in Scotland. So that was really took some time to understand the Welsh context. And then we did a baseline survey to say where are people starting from, because recognizing that people will be starting from lots of different places. Some will be more immersed in the issue, some will be coming at it completely new. Many of the teachers that we spoke to, for example, had never been to a prison, hadn't really thought about what prison might mean until they were themselves supporting students in that situation. The background to the research, or background to commissioning of the research, focused on a project in Wales called the Invisible Walls Wales project, which is a very, very innovative project, which started in Park Prison, in which teachers actually come into the prison to basically run a parents' evening in a prison to speak to the dads, but also have the dads and the teachers and the children meet together in really quite a celebratory environment. And you'll hear a bit more about that from Ben in a moment. But we did a 2-day site visit, including one of these school zone events. But that gave us an opportunity to speak to children directly who had received that kind of support, been involved, speak to their parents and carers, speak to the dads in prison, and speak to the prison staff and to the teachers who were experiencing this, many of them, again, who had never been into a prison before. We also observed a school zone event at HMP Cardiff, which was their first school zone event. The one at Park had been operating for quite a few years, so it was very, very well established. So we were keen to see what that looked like in a newer context as well. We took the learning from that to develop some research, some of our research questions, but we also held a stakeholder event with, again, looking at that cross-sector approach to how we support children in this situation. And that event in itself was incredibly useful, just because it brought people together to talk about these issues for the first time and understand how they might work, how they work within their own context, but also how they might work more collaboratively. And that in itself, that experience of bringing people together was just incredibly important and really, really informative, and something that, again, we've recommended happen again in future, to work about how we develop models within local areas and how we do that across Wales. But that developed, again, the questions that we needed to take forward for the latter phases. So towards the end, we actually did a consultation with 38 key stakeholders, again, across practice experience in schools and prisons and social work teams and education and all these different disparate areas of practice, as well as policymakers, people who could actually create those changes, whether that was part of the education or the justice divisions within Welsh Government, or whether that were looking at trauma-informed practice and what was already in place in Wales that we could build upon, as well as speaking to children, young people, and their parents and carers from across Wales. And then obviously we've produced the final report, which probably took the longest of all the part of the project. The project ran from August 2023 to July 2024, and then the rest of the time has been pulling together what turned out to be quite a robust report, much bigger than we anticipated, but there was so much to say and so much learning from this. And I really look forward to actually being able to look at the report, which should be hopefully in the next few weeks. But I'm going to pass over to Ben to talk a little bit more about the background to what we found and why this is such an important piece of work.
Thank you, Nancy. So I thought it'd be just worth explaining a bit about the impact that occurs for children when a parent is imprisoned. In general terms, I appreciate some people will be very aware of that, some people might be less aware of that. So first thing to observe is the big difference whether a mum or a dad goes to prison, with much more disruption coming to children if a mum goes to prison. I think the statistics are something like 90% of children who have a mum in prison will actually end up living in a different home to the one before, but where they lived before their mum was sentenced, which contrasts to 95% of children staying with their mum if a dad goes to prison. So very important to recognise that. Also, I suppose stigma overhangs this whole situation. So children who have a parent in prison, it might be very hard to talk about it. They might even have a family rule that they can't talk about it. Families in this situation are quite wary of coming forward and declaring that this is something that's affecting their lives for worry of being judged, which of course has an impact on children in the sense that they're often bottling up feelings of loss, feelings of sadness, which in turn can cause mental health issues. So children can be very worried about the parent in prison. If they're visiting, they'll get some information, but if they're not visiting, that can be very stressful, wondering if they're okay. But also, we know that for children, they can suffer decline in their schoolwork because of all the stresses they're facing, all these distractions. The family can face a dent in their finances because there's loss of earnings. And so I think coming back to stigma, I think it's worth saying too that for children with a mum in prison, the stigma is even worse because, as we know, there's about 4% of the prison population is female. And so it's a rarer situation, it's harder to talk about. So just worth explaining some of those background issues. And also, of course, it's a recognised adverse childhood experience, an ACE, having a parent in prison, internationally recognised. So one thing we're very keen to not buy into within the project was this idea that often the way support for children with a parent in prison is spoken about is in the context of preventing parental reoffending, or indeed their own chances of becoming caught up in criminal justice in later life. And we had a very, I suppose we wanted to take a child's rights-based approach to say, look, children are deserving of support in their own right, not in the context of these other reasons, if you like. So I think the framing was very important in terms of this being something children have a right to support, and it shouldn't be wrapped up in these other concerns. So we, as Nancy's already said, we were privileged to look at different support programs within Wales, and I'm going to talk about the school zone model at Park Prison in a moment. But we also had the chance to go to Berwyn Prison, and we saw the support that Barnardo's were providing. But overall, we found there were lots of good initiatives which were happening in Wales, but it's about having consistency across Wales and building on existing practice, so that it's not a postcode lottery exactly in terms of where that occurs. And as Nancy said, the report is a long document with lots of appendices, which you can read more about this. So one of the aspects of the project we were charged to do was to do a case study of the school zone model of support for children, which occurs at Park Prison. So as Nancy said, it's a parents' evening that basically happens during an afternoon or a morning within the prison. And it was such a privilege to be there and to see firsthand the benefits for all concerned. And as Nancy mentioned, we had the chance to talk in focus groups to dads, to children, to the carers of the children, and to prison staff. So I suppose it's really important to say that within Park Prison, there's a fantastic environment. The visits hall is very light and airy, and it lends itself to having an event of this nature and to putting people at their ease. But as Nancy mentioned, it's interesting that as people arrived, of course, each stakeholder had some anxiety, depending on how often they'd visited the prison before. And for many teachers coming in, they were quite anxious. We could feel that as we went into the prison with them. They're quite apprehensive about what they're going to find and what it was going to be like. And of course, everybody has to go through security, etc. But that's very, very significant, because one of the great things that the School Zone project does, it brings, I suppose, on a visceral, emotional level, the feelings that children experience going into a prison. The teachers experience that firsthand, being searched, having dogs involved, etc., having quite stern-faced people doing the searching. And I think, obviously, this is very important for when the children are back at school. The teachers kind of have that memory and they can understand what's happening. The benefits of the School Zone model are just immense. So just to bring it alive a bit, the visits hall was set out with round tables. Well, maybe they weren't round, but they were tables that basically the teachers, the dad in prison, the carers, and most importantly, the children all sat round together. Teachers came with the children's schoolwork. The teacher said that the intensity of the interest in the schoolwork was, way beyond anything in a normal parents' evening. And the teachers very helpfully had handouts of different aspects that dads could take back to their cells after and reflect on and look at. But I won't say too much because I could go on forever. Time is limited. But I think so many things for children, what they told us was that it joined up different parts of their world that weren't normally joined up. And that was incredibly normalizing and therapeutic for them, to see the dad who's in prison, who's excluded from most things in their life, actually being able to talk freely to the teachers and to be valued as well, and to be seen as part of their family. And that was incredibly therapeutic. But also children were just so happy that their teachers could sort of have some understanding of this world that's normally so hidden and invisible to other people. The dads, interestingly, they were very apprehensive that the teachers were going to judge them, that they were going to, not really want to engage with them. And of course, the dads felt so pleased that the teachers took them seriously, saw them as a valuable member of the family, worthy of explaining children's schoolwork to. And that was incredibly good for their confidence and their feeling of, being an involved dad. And it inspired them to increase their own education. And Alice and I were in the focus groups for dads, and one or two dads were saying, well, I never used to go into parents' evenings, but now I make a point of going, when I'm released. So that was incredibly positive, and obviously incredibly positive for children to have the dads involved in that way. And for the teachers, it was interesting. Their eyes were absolutely open to the reality of prison visits. They talked about they realized the financial cost of getting there, the emotional cost, and they became advocates to actually tell their colleagues that, I suppose, speak more positively about parents who are in prison, to not stigmatize and other. So the whole experience was incredibly positive. And for the carers of the children, again, the normalizing, the valuing of the father who was kind of excluded from family life in so many ways was so therapeutic. And the whole family spoke very, very positively about other services they received from Invisible Walls. Obviously, we recognise, I'll be wrapping up very soon on this, but we recognise that School Zone I think there were 16 families who were involved, and of course that's a small percentage of the families in prison. So it's a fantastic intervention, but of course for lots of its reach obviously is narrow because of the resource intensity of it, and we made us think about School Zone was clearly a amazing, fantastic intervention, but also it's about looking at things within the community, other collaborations, and other services, supporting children, not just in the prison, but in the community as well. But I shall finish what I've said. I've just given you a flavour, really. And then I think you can read the feedback here. for yourselves. But I think children, this is really illustrating how the children felt it was so important that their teachers kind of understood what it was like coming into a prison. And this was very, very helpful as well, because teachers said how, because they'd shared this experience with children, it opened up conversations going forward. So if the child was upset in school, they could kind of refer back to the school zone event, and it sort of opened up what could have been really quite difficult conversations. And you can see the quote about teachers' eyes being open to the reality. And also this comment by a teacher, we'll understand their behaviour more now, it help us to provide consistent support. So I think sometimes, teachers didn't understand why children might be withdrawn or might actually be angry or playing up, and it kind of meant that they had a more compassionate approach. I mean, I think for the parent carer at the bottom, they're dealing with so much because they're supporting their children, the parent in prison, and holding the family together. And it sometimes feels to them an unbearable burden. And you see here, it says, I can't even explain how beneficial this has been for me. People don't seem to understand the stress, the devastation, the daily obstacles that we go through. That somehow, I think teachers coming to a prison, making that effort, I think felt it was a validation of what they were going through, and an acknowledgement was very, very powerful for them too.
Thanks, Ben. So what we were tasked to do from all our activities, from the initial phases, the visit to park, and then the stakeholder event that Nancy spoke about, and then interviews, was look at what does an all Wales model look like? What are the elements, the ingredients that are needed? And this is a summary of our findings. So we found that all these elements around the outside, and we'll talk to them in terms of our recommendations shortly, but these are all really essential. So we need to make sure that there's support for all children in Wales, including those who are not visiting a prison. We need to make sure that that support is available in the community, that it's not all just through the prison. We need to look at identification and make sure that that is sensitive and invites families into support rather than further stigmatizes them. And we need to make sure that everything is underpinned by a child's rights approach. So as Ben said, it's not about the outcome for the parent, but it's about improving children's well-being and children's educational attainment and attendance. Huge element was training and having practitioners really understanding the issues. And you can see the different elements there. And one thing that really came across through in every stage was this need for consistency and centralized information, a place where everyone can go, families and practitioners, where they can find out where to access further support. And right at the center of all of these elements is, of course, the child. But we wanted to, it was very clear, and we all recognize this, of course, a child is not in isolation. A child is in relationship with their parent, both that in custody, even if they're not visiting that parent, or if they don't have an ongoing relationship with that parent is still someone in their life that they need to process what's happened. And then the parent in the community. That child is part of a wider community, school, and then prison if they're visiting. Perhaps they're involved in other family services or charities. And then holding all of that is the policy and the resourcing underpinning it that influences the culture, the systems, and the resources. So we put this together to sort of create a visual of what are the important elements, and how do we make sure that it's child centres while recognising that child is not in isolation, and that all of these elements need to hold together. And just to say, when you read the report, there's two lovely case studies that pull out when this works well. There's a lovely case study of a boy called Evan, whose mum was in prison, and all the elements here were there for Evan. His mum went to prison. He was looked after by his grandmother. She knew where to go for support. The people in Evan's life had training. It was all there, and Evan continued to attend school and do really well and be supported in the right way for him throughout that journey. Contrasting that, there's a case study in the report about Megan, and none of these elements were there. Megan's mother, it was also her mother, went to prison, and she ended up living alone as a child in a house, completely ignored by the systems that should be supporting her. And none of these elements were there for her. And so those two case studies, when you read the report, are really worth going to, because they highlight absolutely beautifully and devastatingly in Megan's case what it looks like when the support is not there, and how it should be for every child in Wales. So we pulled out a set of recommendations, and we're really calling this, for the Welsh Government, an opportunity here, a huge opportunity for change. So the first recommendations around this strengths-based children's rights approach, saying it's got to be rooted in the rights of children, and this is about what's going on for the child, and what they need. And often at the moment there's this kind of deficit model focusing on children as current problems or future problems, or focusing on the outcomes for the parent, and so the focus on the child gets sidelines. And so one of our suggested actions, so under each recommendation we've got a list of suggested actions, and on this we are recommending that the UNCRC is fully incorporated into domestic law in Wales, as is the case in Scotland, and that there's a children and young people's forum to inform the design of a pan-Wales model. So right from the beginning you've got children and young people involved. We've also recommended the use of child impact assessments to make sure that children's own needs are considered at every stage of their parents' journey. Recommendation 2 relates to policy and resourcing, and making sure that there's a consistent pan-Wales commitment. And this was highlighted throughout our findings. So we had it was very much a postcode lottery. There was one family where 2 children ended up in 2 different local authorities because of their school. One was offered really helpful support, and one was completely ignored and received nothing. And that was simply a postcode lottery. And what we're recommending is that there's a pan-Wales strategy, that it's co-developed with children and young people, that it involves cross-departmental commissioning, so that funding isn't siloed and only relating to justice. It needs to come across the department, so that it incorporates all children. And that funding is sustainable and not just these short-term pockets that are incredibly frustrating for organisations. This idea of centralised information, so that all children have access to consistent and appropriate support, that came up again and again. And we had concrete suggested actions for an online information hub that's integrated into existing systems like the Welsh, and I'm going to pronounce it wrong, but the Wales Hub, I think it's called, where families know where to go, where practitioners know where to go, where there's offers of training and resources, and there's this centralised place. And then, looking at who updates that, who makes sure that that's, continually updated, and that information is relevant. Multi-agency working, hugely important. That was a key element, as Ben said, of the park model, that different agencies working together. But there was a recognition through our findings that so often it becomes siloed, and we need to make sure that commissioning models are not setting organisations up to be against each other, but are actually conducive to collaboration. So built right into the model, right from its inception, is this collaboration. Really, really important. Training was really important. The next couple of recommendations relate to training. One of the things we did in the report, our recommendation was to develop a detailed understanding of current training, and we actually provided that in our report. We detail all the training providers that offer training around the impact of imprisonment on families, and that needs to obviously be continually updated and sit somewhere on like this central hub that we talked about. And that need for training to be good quality, to be one that challenges unhelpful narratives. So not training that's around, that you often hear these narratives around, if we don't support children with a parent in prison, they'll end up in prison too. We really wanted to challenge those narratives and say this is about a children's rights approach and recognizing that with support, children, even facing such an adverse experience as this, can reach their potential. And how do you integrate the voice of children into training, and all of that? Recommendation 7 was around identification, and we recognize it's really complicated identification, and requires a lot of sorry, if I skipped on, yeah, no, it's identification, yeah, recognizing the sensitivities around it. So for example, children have under the UNCRC a right to privacy. So we need to be very careful about how we share information, recognizing that having a parent in the justice system isn't a safeguarding concern in and of itself. There might be safeguarding concerns, but it isn't necessarily the case that every child with a parent in the justice system, there's a safeguarding concern. Often those children are very well looked after by the remaining adult or another family member. So just looking at how we do that in a way that's really sensitive, very important. And we suggested bringing together multi-agency groups, including families with lived experience, and making sure that schools are safe places where families can disclose what's happened and get the support they need, and making sure that prisons as well are places where staff feel confident in understanding the issues and know how to signpost families to support. And I'll pass on to Nancy.
Thanks so much. So we just have a few more recommendations to go, and then we can enter into some discussion because there's a lot to talk about here. Certainly looking at recommendation 10, it's just making sure that that support is consistent. And Sarah's already talked about the need for consistency, but recognizing that it's not a one-size-fits-all approach. There are children in very different circumstances, children who may not want to maintain contact, people who might be, in danger, and it's safer for them not to have that contact, or conversely, those who have, a family member in prison outside of Wales. So the child might be in Wales, but their dad or mum is in prison in England, for example. So it's trying to recognize that support needs to be as flexible as possible. There might be children with special needs. It could be any number of things. So what we talked about is appointing a cross-governmental lead, for example, for children who has oversight of the policy and practice and the challenges and the opportunities that brings in. And making sure that any kind of pan-Wales strategy recognizes there's a need to support all children, regardless of the circumstances that they're in. Recommendation 11 talks about the fact, again, we can't rely solely on in-prison provision because not all children are visiting. And in fact, statistics across the UK is that only about half of people in prison receive visits. And we know that some families can't travel, or they don't wish to, or there could be a family breakdown of relationships, could be any number of reasons that people aren't able to travel to prison. So that support needs to be available more broadly. So that means that schools, provide a huge opportunity, regardless of what type of school or what type of educational support that is, to provide that support, as well as other type of more independent organizations. So we're talking about making sure that the staff from all of these sectors receive training on the impact of parental imprisonment so that they can provide that support, and that includes focus on equality and diversity and inclusion, for example, but also about building partnerships between schools and prisons by implementing something similar to School Zone, but also recognize they might be able to use online technology to support participation in that, while being cognizant of considerations identified in inspectorate reports, for example, and in case studies. The recommendation 12, and we're nearly there, I promise, is making sure that any model actually provides support for parents and carers as well. These children are not, or children who have a parent in prison don't exist in isolation. There will be someone, hopefully someone supporting them, and they need that support as well. It's not easy being in this situation. It can often have a financial impact. It can have an impact on your health and your emotional well-being. So there needs to be a broader support, recognizing that we can't just look at children in isolation. So that suggested action under that was about increasing or including funding for services, including peer support, for example, to make sure that the parents and carers are included in that support. Recommendation 13, basically, again, make sure that we have safeguarding policies in place. And as Sarah already mentioned, not every case is a safeguarding case. but it's recognizing that we need to consider what that might mean. And the report talks about creating a key standard about safeguarding within a charter about children impacted by parental imprisonment. All of the detail is in the report, so you'll get to hear about that, including safeguarding as a standing agenda item in any kind of multi-agency national steering group. But basically, I think the focus that Sarah spoke about already on child impact assessments, we need to understand what the circumstances of the child are, and that will differ from family to family. Recommendation 14 was about developing an improved understanding overall. So that means, for example, the School Health Research Network in Wales could provide an opportunity to collaborate about how we collect data, how we recognize children with a parent in prison as a specific category in need of support, or a specific category of children who are more vulnerable to breaches of their rights, for example, and considering how other data sets in Wales might be used to inform that knowledge and to bring together the collective knowledge, some of which is already there, but recognizing children in this situation as part of that. And then 15, they're only 16, so we're getting there. Recommendation 15 is, again, making sure that we look at how we measure outcomes. How do we know that this model works? How do we know that we've succeeded? And that whether that's identifying smart outcomes or fast outcomes or whatever it is, but looking at a child rights framework for this. And the Children's Commission in Wales has been excellent in providing that kind of model for support. That makes us recognize against how we can measure the interventions and services against that. And then finally, making sure that the children and young people are central to all of this, that they're the ones who determine what their needs are and what kind of support works for them, so that we're monitoring progress against those outcomes that are informed directly by them and for them. And again, the child impact assessments are one way of doing that. But more broadly, with the report as a whole, this is a huge opportunity to think differently about how we support children when a parent or another family member goes to prison. So one thing that is interesting about a pan-Wales model, for example, is that in Wales, justice is not a devolved issue. Justice is lumped in as England and Wales, and a lot of the focus and the funding for this type of work comes from justice. If you're looking at a pan-Wales model, education and health are devolved issues, so the support and the funding can come from that, which reframes the whole conversation in terms of how we could think about children when a parent goes to prison. This isn't a justice issue. It's a consequence of a decision made as part of a justice process, but we need to think about these children as children, and not as Ben talked about the framing, not as future offenders or as tools in the resettlement of their parent. But keen to have a conversation. I think we've actually finished 2 minutes prior to our allocated 40 minutes. So I'm very happy about that. So I'm really keen to have a conversation. Really interesting questions already coming up in the chat. So look forward to chatting.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Amazing timing. Well done. That's great. So lots of questions in the chat, some of which have been answered already by School Zone, the people who are here from School Zone. But I'll just quickly run over them. What age are the children involved, and what works for older children when they don't have a single class teacher? And Gemma Jones has responded saying the age range is varied, both primary and secondary schools attend, and with older children, very often the head of the year or pastoral teacher will attend. Helen has asked a question, Helen Hodges. So, I mean, I don't know if you want to add to that, Nancy.
Yeah, can I just jump in just quickly? And it's what's interesting to me is I've just had this conversation in a previous meeting, is that the impact of a parent going to prison is a lifelong impact. It's not always just people who are of school age, for example, and it's trying to look at how we recognize that and can support the kind of longer term consequences. And I can see that Sarah was probably about to say the same thing, so go ahead.
Exactly the same thing, and to say that, there's a huge variation in support needs with a very young child. Children who are pre-language or who have limited language as they then go up through. And we often hear from teenagers there's very little in terms of support for them, and they sometimes find the support that's offered, is more relevant to younger children. And So it's a huge issue, actually. There's somebody doing a PhD at the moment looking at the support needs of teenagers. But
And
it's
support
not
at university age as well.
and university, yeah, and it stays with you. And we had a young adult on our advisory group who his mum went to prison when he was at school. He's now at university, and it continues to have an impact. So yeah.
I also go on, Ben. Sorry.
I was only going to just add that Nancy and I had some contact with someone called China, who was the personal assistant to Michelle Obama, who talked about how, you know, into her mid-30s, when she was in that role, she found it very, very hard to talk about the fact that she'd had a father in prison. In fact, when she did disclose it, the Obamas, as you can imagine, were very kind of empathic and understanding and everything. But it just highlighted how the long tail of that situation stays with you, even when however established you are, if that makes sense.
And I don't think it's been mentioned, but just to clarify that we don't have any women's prisons in Wales. So if a mother goes to prison, clearly children will need to be travelling long distances across the border if they are going to visit their mother, which is why one of the reasons it's a very significant impact. Helen was asking about older children. I guess also, you know, what happens if children aren't going to school, who's supporting them, or once they've left school. Helen Hodges has also asked, what about release on temporary licence? To what extent is this being used to enable imprisoned parents to attend parents' evenings or key options meetings, such as deciding which GCSEs to take, or if a child is being permanently excluded from school? So really good question. Thanks, Helen. I don't know if anyone feels in a position to answer that.
I think all of us probably have a little bit of input that we can provide. I'm very conscious that, and Ben touched on this in his example of the school zone, is that a lot of families in this situation don't necessarily feel confident to engage with schools, and it might not be top on their priorities if they're released on a temporary license that is very short term, and so that might not be top of their list of what they might do, especially if they're not confident in doing so. We have certainly in Scotland supported children to have, for example, online meetings with a parent in prison to help choose the subjects that they might be going on to study at GCSE level or equivalent. But it really is often a case-by-case basis in terms of what type of support they can actually access, and it's hugely variable. And I think that's what we're trying to address with some of the research, is trying to make sure that these opportunities are standard and not exceptional. But Sarah and Ben, I don't know if you want to come in.
I mean, just to say what you said, Nancy, that I think what's really important is that it's child by child, within family by family, and that even within families, there'll be different support needs within groups of siblings, and it will depend hugely on what the relationship is like with whoever's in prison and the relationship with the wider family. But I think what's important is that that as many options of including parents in prison where appropriate in their children's lives are available and considered, and that as many of the barriers that we can take down as possible are taken down, because we know that for many children it's a really important to have that ongoing relationship, and just because you're in prison doesn't mean you're no less a good parent. Now, there will be situations where it's not appropriate for that, and those children also need support. So it's about just considering every single case in its you know, on its own merit. And I think Corin may have put a comment in around Rottal as well, release on temporary license. Yeah.
Well, I'd just add as well, I think clearly the face-to-face school zone model at Park is the absolute kind of Rolls-Royce gold standard and delivers so many benefits from being face-to-face. But at the same time, there's such a role for virtual school zone, if you like, or that kind of contact between schools and families of somebody in prison. Because, of course, often people who are held in prisons miles and miles away from the schools, and the teachers coming in would be impractical. But actually, to do it virtually is a good second best. So I think we reflected on that during the project, certainly.
Just to say as well, I think what came out of our work as well is it's got to start with what are the support needs of the child, not what are the outcomes of the adult. They've got their own that goes on anyway, and that's important. But this works about what are the support needs of this child, and so that's why things like the child impact assessment, really helping children draw out what it is that they need, and then what can we do around that to support that, I think is really important.
And I think that's a risk of some of the programs from a justice focus as well, is that it tends to be used as an incentive for the parent, as opposed to recognizing this is a child's right and what they deserve as a child, as opposed to being using as a tool to manage behavior, for example. I think we have to be really, really careful with that.
Yeah.
Thank you. So I'm just scrolling down now, and there've been a couple of questions about whether, when a child takes time off to visit a prison, whether that's an authorised absence or whether it in fact impacts on their attendance record. And Helen Hodges has suggested that, if it is being monitored, that it's an opportunity to enable monitoring to inform our practice as well.
Just to say on that, Alison, I think what's really key element there is the training that's needed for teachers, for education welfare officers, to understand that these absences to visit a parent can and should be authorised, and that there needs to be that ongoing conversation with families. What nobody wants children to be missing huge chunks of school, and it's about communication, transparency. When we've met children who are having to lie to the teacher about another dentist appointment because they're actually visiting dad in prison, nobody wants that. We all want children to be able to be honest, and families to have those honest conversations, and we want schools to be understanding and gracious around absences, and to have that conversation to say we can authorise absences, but if your child's missing school every Friday, are there ways that we can look at prison visits? Can prisons offer a flexibility? So it's everyone working together, it's not just so that's where that multi-agency collaboration is really important. So everybody's playing their part, with the child and the family right at the centre of that conversation in an open, honest way. I think that's really helpful.
Yeah, and as again, going back to a child's rights perspective as well, we don't want, under UNCRC, there's a right to education, and we don't want the fact that a parent is in prison to disadvantage a child in accessing their education. But you're absolutely right, Sarah, in terms of making sure that it is a collaborative approach, so that prisons are flexible enough to offer visiting times that might not require a child to miss school.
Yeah.
I mean, sometimes the distances are such that that's the only option, but it's trying to make it as flexible as possible. And as you say, working to make sure there's additional support perhaps for them, to take homework with them or something, just to make it more feasible, so this isn't a material disadvantage, because that's the kind of disadvantage that perpetuates the risk and the disconnect that we were trying to avoid.
And talking to children about this issue, they'll talk about how there are certain moments when visiting is so important. Like if a parent's moved to another prison, they kind of need to know that parent's okay. So if they can quickly visit that parent, hopefully see they're okay, then their mind's at ease, and they can, or as much as it can be, and they can focus on schoolwork. But if they have to wait a whole week to have that visit to the weekend, they may not be able to focus on schoolwork anyway because they're so worried. So I think strategic planning for those visits and recognizing there are certain important moments is important too.
Okay, thank you. Just scrolling through the chat, Sarah, you've put a link up there to the Child Impact Assessment Project, if anyone's interested in finding out more about that. There's a comment from Corinne Morgan Armstrong from Invisible Walls, just noting that there's very little ROTL in Wales in recent times, but Invisible Walls School Zone operates at HMP Prescoed 2, which is the open prison for Wales. Zach Lyndon Jones has said it's important to take the stress off the child. Is there support put in place to the children during this time, such as one-to-one support, mentoring, that could be around a subject they enjoy? I guess it doesn't need to be related to school, and the mentor, and having a mentor who understands their circumstances. Any comments from speak?
I think that one-to-one support and mentoring is really valuable. Just that children have that safe space to be honest about how they're feeling, and particularly, you know, a lot of children have conflicting emotions, so they deeply miss their parent in prison and feel very sad, and yeah, they might also be really angry with them and slightly relieved that they're not around in the family home. And it's quite hard to talk about those conflicting emotions within the family sometimes, and a lot of children feel very protective of the remaining parent or really angry with the remaining parent. And so I think having one-to-one support and mentors, somebody to get gently alongside the child, certainly from the programs we've all seen, hugely important, and a very necessary element of support, and that can happen in the community, in the child's space, if you like. So it's not about that support was happening connected to the prison. It's about, you know, the child being supported in their own environment. So
I like the comment though at the end about being around a subject they enjoy, because this is something that you've spoken about, Sarah, as well, is that we're talking about whole children here, and they might be upset or struggling for a completely different reason. But they might have a parent in prison, but that's not, you know, they don't always want to be drawn back to that. It might be they're just upset that day, or they just had a bad sleep. You know, there could be any other reasons, trying to recognize children as, again, as children. I think there are some really interesting models of that kind of mentoring support where they do match. I think Children Heard and Seen does some of this as well, where they match children with a mentor that's, you know, able to support them in a particular activity, or something that is, you know, they have kind of shared interests, for example. But so much of it is as well just recognizing the value of children not feeling like they're the only ones in the situation. And Time Matters UK does some really interesting work about, you know, children's peer support. That's it, in Liverpool, where they you know, recognize that they're not alone in this, and they have other people that they can, you just enjoy being around and not feel that they're having to keep a secret from them.
Okay. So having a mentor, really important to develop resilience for the child, but it doesn't need to be linked to the prison. It could be in the child's home community, or a range of different models that exist. We've now got a question just to say about when the report will be available. Just to reiterate that it will be available once it's been released by Welsh Government, and we're hoping that that will be in the next couple of weeks. There's a question here from Helen Hodges, who's being very active. Thank you, Helen. Linking to recommendation 14, do we know how many children this affects in Wales, and what proportion can be supported or are being supported at the moment and or looked after by other family members? We currently don't collect data on children taken into care as a result of parental imprisonment. Wondering about numbers as well, the impact and scale of resources required. Very big question there.
That's one for Nancy, definitely.
Nancy,
oh gosh, this is let's open a huge can of worms just before we end. Identification of children is problematic in a lot of ways. As a commitment under the Labour Manifesto to identify children when a parent goes to prison, and I think Sarah mentioned this at the beginning. It is helpful to know the numbers, but we also have to recognize that there's a lot of stigma attached to this, and how it's done, and who asks, and what they use the information for. And, you know, there are lots of questions around that can be, if it's not done well, it can be quite damaging. So it's how we know who these children are in order to provide support. It's the asking to give rather than asking just to get the information. But, you know, how do we do that? How do we do it sensitively? What can we do with that information? So short answer, no, we don't know the exact numbers. Most countries actually use averages and birth rates and crime rates, you know, kind of in prison rates and birth rates, and extrapolate some sort of figure. But we know, you know, the birth rates will not necessarily be consistent. It'll give a good guess. But at the moment, estimates in England and Wales, for example, estimate that the number of children each year who experience a parent's imprisonment is anywhere between 200,000 to 310,000. So, you know, it just depends on who you ask. So, yeah, we could have a long conversation just about that subject. You're absolutely right that we do need to know especially in terms of planning, in terms of policy development, you really want to have at least a rough idea of how many people you're talking about, and then how many people what proportion of those are actually accessing support. We know there are more children out there than we can possibly support at the moment with the current support that's available. But we're still dealing with very, very rough figures. And I got myself completely distracted. I don't know if I answered all the rest of the question.
Yeah, I think you probably did as well as you could. I mean, I don't think we can hazard a guess at what proportion of children are being supported at the moment, but I think probably relatively small. It would be fair to say, wouldn't it, Sarah?
Because we have to know who they are, and as I said before, most of the ones who are receiving support are those who are visiting prisons, and we know they don't all visit. But Sarah, I interrupted you.
No, it was just to add to what you're saying, and my mind's just gone blank. I'm very unhelpful.
Put you on the spot now. Sorry about that.
Yeah, sorry, I had a lovely little something to add, and So interestingly, when we spoke to children and young people for this project, almost all of them said they wanted the school to know, but when you went underneath that, it was they wanted to be in control of that as well. So families were telling the school, and when they said the school, it was actually that particular teacher. So we have to be very careful about these blunt ways of passing on information. We need to make sure that families are included in that, so families know who knows what and why. That for this particular group of people in society, it's so sensitive. And you're talking about people whose personal and private details are splashed across newspaper headlines, and we've not even talked about the impact of social media when crimes are reported and addresses are published, which is in effect the children's addresses, and the impact of that is enormous. So families feel really sensitive, understandably very hesitant about who knows what and why, and I think we have to bear that in mind and make sure that whatever methods of data collection that we land on are ones that are rooted in a children's rights approach, that are sensitive. They're asking, as Nancy said, so that we can offer support, not just so that we can get information, and that we explain very clearly to families what's going to happen to this information. And that really matters to families, and we heard that again and again and again, and I think that's something we cannot overemphasize.
Can I just final comment here from Zach Lyndon Jones. They're at Cardiff City Football Club Community Foundation, and they're able to provide mentoring like this, giving the child a mentoring support. But we talk through communication, positive relationships, positive well-being, coping strategies, having fun. So that would be a really innovative approach. I mean, we know there's a lot of research about resilience and doing sports and different types of activities and arts, etc. So, that would be a very innovative approach.
Sorry, Alison, just to jump into the work I've been doing on child impact assessments, exactly that, Zach. It's around, children often have people in their lives through sports clubs and through who they've already got good relationships with. And those are the people that children really want to be able to open up about this topic. And what we've found is that people who are very, very good at getting alongside children, often when it comes to this topic, panic, and they think, I don't know anything about criminal justice. And actually what children and young people say is exactly that, what Zach offers. They want spaces where they can just be, where they can talk, and it's a lot of the skills that are already there. So I think there's something really important about a joined up approach here, and saying, organizations that offer general mentoring are excellent. You don't need to be a specialist in a specialist organization that focuses on support for children affected by imprisonment, as important as those organizations also are, because they offer, but we want any organization that interfaces with children to be aware that this is also an issue that children may face, and this is the kind of support that can help.
Yeah, I mean, you talked about that as well in some of the training that you developed for teachers, Sarah, and in the school's toolkit for COPE as well, is that, identification is helpful, but you don't have to know who those children are in your classroom to be able to support them. It's about talking about the issue more generally, about, just making sure that children feel confident that they can come forward to speak to someone if they wish. So it's, that's the type of thing, with the mentoring support, it can be more general, and that gives children the confidence and develops the relationships they need to trust to be able to be open about what's happening in their lives. And that's really, really key. So it's great to see, you know, a positive response like that. It's really, we want to see more of that, please.
So that's brought us up to 1 o'clock, so perfect timing. Can I just say thank you once again, and if people have any further comments, if they could forward them via ExChange, we'll be happy to respond. Okay, thank you so much, and we look forward to seeing the report.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.